Hello. So bonjour, good morning. Thank you for joining me this morning. Yesterday, the Right Honourable David Johnston tendered his resignation as the independent special rapporteur to the Prime Minister. J'aimerais remercier Monsieur Johnston pour son travail à titre de rapporteur spécial et pour les décennies qu'il a consacrées au service du Canada. La manière dont Pierre Poilievre et le Parti conservateur ont tenté d'entacher la réputation de cet éminent Canadien au cours des dernières semaines est absolument méprisable. La protection de notre démocratie exige que nous nous élevons au-dessus de la partisanerie. Le Canada n'est pas le seul pays à être confronté à la menace de l'ingérence étrangère. Nombre de nos alliés ont, en ce moment même, des discussions très similaires sur la meilleure façon de protéger leur démocratie contre ce fléau. S'ils sont capables d'avoir ces discussions raisonnées et constructives à ce sujet, le Canada devra être capable d'en faire autant. That's why the Prime Minister tasked me yesterday with consulting over the coming days experts, legal scholars, and opposition parties on what the next steps should look like and determine who best may be suited to lead this public work. As I undertake this assignment, our efforts to combat foreign interference in our democracy continue, as they have since we came into government. The National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians and the National Security Review and Intelligence Agency are also conducting their own reviews of the classified annex of Mr. Johnston's report, as well as a broader review of the measures currently in place to combat foreign interference. It's our government's hope that the opposition parties will treat this issue with the seriousness it deserves, and that we will be able to chart a path forward that will strengthen Canadians' confidence in our democracy. Merci, thank you, and I'm obviously happy to take your questions.
Minister, isn't the obvious situation here that a public inquiry needs to be called?
A public inquiry has never been off the table. All options remain on the table. The Prime Minister said so when he announced the appointment of Mr. Johnston. My job is to, in the very next few days, in short order, ask opposition leaders to take this matter seriously, not just to simply say, oh, there has to be a public inquiry. Okay, make suggestions about who could lead this public inquiry. What would the terms of reference be? What do they see as the timelines? How do they deal with the obvious challenge of respecting Canadian law that protects some of the most sensitive intelligence information? Those are the kinds of conversations we're prepared to have in very short order. We've said all along that all options remain on the table. We think there should be a public process going forward, as Mr. Johnston recommended. So my hope is very quickly we can come to some consensus around those next steps. I think Canadians would benefit from that work.
What makes you think that the opposition will take this seriously?
We have a number of reasons to see how they can choose to not take it seriously. Certainly Mr. Poilievre, who attacked Mr. Johnston, engaged in character assassination, partisan buffoonery. If he says this is a serious issue, this is the moment very quickly to come back to me and say, we think that these are two examples of the kind of people who could lead this. We think this should be the terms of reference. Here's how we suggest that you deal with the obvious legal impediment around dealing with highly classified information. Serious leaders would have serious suggestions on those issues. I'll be consulting with former justices, experts in this space. We have always said that this next phase should include a public process, but we're now giving the opposition parties something they've asked for, is a chance to have input directly into that process and not simply stand up in question period and demand a public inquiry and not offer any constructive suggestions as to how that might operate.
What happens now with those public meetings that were scheduled to happen this summer? Are they going to get canceled? Are you hoping someone else will take over? What does that look like?
Well, so obviously Mr. Johnston's decision to step aside is as a result of the toxic partisan climate that was created largely by the Conservative Party and other opposition parties as well. We are not looking to delay this process at all. Our hope is that in the coming days we can receive specific suggestions from opposition parties, including the names of individuals they think could be suited to lead this process, suggestions around the terms of reference, the timelines. One of the challenges would be many eminent Canadians will understandably hesitate to step forward to undertake this kind of work when they see what the opposition parties did to the Right Honourable David Johnston. So if we can lower the partisan temperature, have a serious conversation about a serious issue, we're confident that we could find the right eminent person to lead this next public phase of the engagement. And quickly, we're not looking for delays. Mr. Johnston decided to step away from this function. My conversation with the Prime Minister yesterday was we need to get on with this and move as quickly as possible, but not simply fall into the dead end again where the opposition parties can discredit and destroy a process. They need to be participants in a constructive path forward.
Why would opposition parties, though, put a name forward when they want a public inquiry in the matter? Why would they?
But who would do the public inquiry? It would be led by an individual, presumably. So they may have suggestions of a particular woman or man who would be well suited. We agree with Mr. Johnston. Ideally, this person would have experience in national security issues. But the seriousness of their contribution will be measured by specific suggestions they make about individuals, about timeline, about terms of reference. How do they propose to deal with Canadian law that protects security of information, the release of which would be detrimental to the lives of people working in our national security agencies, or our ability to work with allies on some of these most sensitive issues. So serious leaders would have serious suggestions around those issues. We'll see in the next few days if that's the case.
Is one of the options that you replace the special rapporteur with another special rapporteur that is more amenable to the opposition parties, and that person, he or she, would take over Mr. Johnston's work from where it left off, picking up with the public inquiry, or are we going back to starting from scratch?
So both of those options would be on the table. We're saying now that the time for serious, constructive solutions has arrived. If the opposition leaders think that another person should pick up the second phase of Mr. Johnston's work, they should say so. We'll be consulting, as I said, with experts, retired judges, and others. If they want, as they've said publicly, a public inquiry, then the responsible suggestion would be to say what kind of person could lead this public inquiry, to make specific suggestions, to talk about how they're going to square the circle around protecting sensitive intelligence information that no country, no responsible country makes public. I was an opposition MP when Mr. Harper refused to make any information public around Afghan detainees. Pierre Poilievre was part of a government that had a history of attacking institutions and individuals. I sat in opposition. I watched them attack the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the Chief Electoral Officer, Marc Méran. I watched them fire the nuclear safety regulator. So this is a pattern that the Conservatives have engaged in. They say this is a serious issue, and we hope that they will make serious suggestions. Our government has taken this issue seriously, and will continue to do so.
You talked about timeline. You talked about timeline, and Mr. Johnston was trying to get these public hearings wrapped up within, I think, 5 months, almost, essentially by the end of the year. How important is that a consideration moving ahead? Because we know public inquiries, not only are they expensive, they take a long time. And can you have an election campaign, because you were in a minority situation, theoretically you could fall at any time. Can you reasonably have an election while a public inquiry is going on into the fairness of elections and possible foreign interference into them?
Well, Glenn, that would be a good question to ask the opposition parties. We're not going to vote no confidence in our own government. So we're hoping to govern until 2025. That's our plan. If the opposition parties decide to get together and defeat the government, they can explain that decision. We're not seeking to delay at all the timelines that Mr. Johnston had laid out. But if at the end of this week, next week, at the end of June, if the opposition parties, for example, have not been able to agree amongst themselves, that was the NDP motion that they all voted in favor of. So maybe they can get together, the three opposition party leaders, and come up with a suggestion of specific individuals, a terms of reference, answer exactly the kind of question you put forward around the timeline. We're prepared as a government to support a public process. We've said that all along. If, as I said, ultimately the decision is to have a public inquiry, that is something the Prime Minister said he would have contemplated as far back as a number of months ago. Mr. Johnston recommended otherwise. We accepted his recommendation. He's decided to step aside. So if we can come up with a public process that benefits from support of opposition parties, it'll be easier to have an eminent Canadian come forward and agree to lead that process. It might be hard to ask somebody to step in to the snowblower that they passed over Mr. Johnston. Oui, en français.
Est-ce que vous avez déclenché une enquête publique et sinon, pourquoi pas?
Bien, nous avons dit depuis le début que toutes les options sont possibles. Nous n'avons pas écarté aucune option. Si ultimement une enquête publique faite de la bonne façon, menée par la personne idéale pour mener cet exercice est possible, nous serons tout à fait ouverts à ces suggestions. Mais le moment pour nous d'être sérieux face à l'opposition est arrivé. L'opposition, depuis le début, n'a pas pris la question au sérieux. Ils ont simplement offert des suggestions avec aucune précision. Ils savent très bien, surtout les conservateurs. M. Poilievre était ministre dans un gouvernement qui a refusé de discuter jamais, qui a refusé de discuter toutes ces questions en termes de renseignements étrangers. Si nous avons le moment maintenant de diminuer le ton partisan, c'est le moment pour les chefs de l'opposition d'offrir des suggestions. M. Blanchet réclame une enquête publique. J'ai bien hâte de recevoir de lui des suggestions, par exemple, de qui est-ce qu'il pense qui peut mener cette enquête, c'est quoi les termes de référence et comment ils vont traiter la question des renseignements nécessairement secrets, parce qu'ils viennent des fois des alliés du Canada et qui sont protégés par la loi canadienne et qui ne peuvent pas être divulgués dans une enquête publique. M. Blanchet ne sera jamais premier ministre du Canada, il n'est pas préoccupé par ça. M. Poilievre devrait être préoccupé par ça. Et franchement, on a hâte de voir, de constater le sérieux de leurs suggestions. Le moment est venu de diminuer le ton partisan et d'avancer idéalement ensemble.
Will one party have more weight over the other, or are you hoping that all the opposition parties come to a consensus together and then come negotiate with the government?
Well, they all voted for an NDP motion last week that said the government should consult with opposition parties. That's exactly what the Prime Minister asked me to do yesterday and what I'm hoping to do tonight, tomorrow, and this week. If the three of them get together, as M. Blanchet has suggested, and come up with a list of the kind of people that could lead this inquiry, suggested terms of reference, it might be easier to get an eminent Canadian to come forward. So really, we're looking for their suggestions, and the time for them to be serious is now.
You see suggestions. So if they come to you and say, hey, we think we should have a public inquiry, as we said all along, this is the person we think should lead it, it's a reasonable person, they come to you, are you obligated to, are you going to accept that then? Are we going to have
We're going to, first of all,
you're going to consider it, but are you going to do it?
well, we have to see who they're going to suggest, Glenn. We have to see the terms of reference.
Is that what it swings on?
If
Who's
they
the person?
come forward...
It sounds like you're ready to call a public inquiry and you're just talking about who's going to lead it.
No, I'm talking about the terms of reference for that public inquiry. I'm talking about how they plan to protect some of the most sensitive intelligence information, the kind of person that might step forward and accept to do this. We're prepared to have those conversations very quickly, and frankly, it would be a lot easier if the three of opposition leaders agreed amongst themselves and made constructive suggestions. So that's very much our hope. That's my invitation to them, and we're going to be having the same conversations, as I said, with retired judges and with experts and others in this space. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you tonight.